himself and walked calmly to the car. Whatever she wanted. It didn't matter. Judge Harkin lived in Gulfport, 15 minutes from the courthouse. As he was getting ready to leave for the courthouse, the phone rang. "Judge, I'm sorry to bother you at home," said a nervous voice. "It's Nicholas Easter." "What's the matter?" The judge wondered how Nicholas had obtained his phone number, but said nothing. "It's about Herrera," Nicholas said. "I think maybe he's reading things that aren't on the approved list. This morning, when I went into the dining room, he was there alone, and he tried to hide a copy of Mogul from me. Isn't that some kind of business magazine?" "Yes, it is," replied Harkin. If Easter was telling the truth, and why should he doubt him, then Herrera would be sent home immediately. The reading of any unauthorized material meant dismissal. "Do you think he's discussed it with anyone else?" "I doubt it. Like I said, he was trying to hide it from me, but I'll listen carefully." "You do that. I'll ask Colonel Herrera to come in and see me this morning. We'll probably search his room." "Please don't tell him I reported him. I really feel bad about doing it." "It's okay. The trial's almost over, Nicholas. I'm asking the lawyers to be as quick as they possibly can." On his way to the court, Harkin called the sheriff and asked him to go to the Siesta Motel and wait. He then called Lou Dell, who told him that Mogul wasn't sold at the motel. He wondered how a sequestered juror could have got a copy of it. When Harkin arrived in court, he told Rohr and Cable what he'd learned, without telling them who'd told him. Both lawyers were unhappy. Cable was annoyed because everyone thought that Herrera would vote with the defense. Rohr was cross because they were going to lose a juror, and there was a danger the trial might have to be repeated. Herrera was called to the judge's chambers, where he was told he had to answer some questions. He felt like a criminal. "Have you been reading any materials not specifically authorized by me, in particular a business weekly magazine called Mogul?" asked the judge. "Not since I've been sequestered," Herrera replied. "Will you agree to a search of your room?" The colonel went red. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "I have reason to believe that you have been reading unauthorized materials at the motel. I think a search of your room would settle the matter," replied the judge. Herrera knew there was nothing in his room. "Then search it," he said between his teeth. In the motel, the sheriff and 2 deputies found the newspapers and magazines under Herrera's bed. They took them to the judge's chambers. The judge showed them to Herrera. "These items were found under the bed in room 50 just minutes ago." Herrera was speechless. "They're not mine," he said angrily. "Somebody must have put them there. The fact is that these were found in your room. I have no choice. You are dismissed from jury service." There were many questions Herrera wanted to ask, but he suddenly realized he'd be on the golf course by lunchtime. "Whatever you say, Judge." The jurors took their seats a few minutes after 10. In the courtroom, the jury watched silently as Judge Harkin showed them a copy of Mogul. He asked if anyone had read it or heard what was in it. No one. "Juror number 7, Frank Herrera, has been dismissed and replaced by the extra juror, Mr. Henry Vu." Fitch's newspaper dropped several inches as he stared at the new juror. He was scared because Herrera had gone, and thrilled because his girl Marley had done exactly what she'd promised. Fitch looked at Easter, who stared back. Cable's first witness on Thursday was Dr. Denise McQuaid. The defense wanted to answer Leon Robilio's claims that kids were targeted by the cigarette industry. Dr. McQuaid was beautiful and clever. She'd written 4 books and many articles. She quickly made her point. Advertising is everywhere. Children are familiar with commercials for all kinds of things the kids eat and drink, like hamburgers and soft drinks. No one accuses those companies of dishonestly targeting the young. Dr. McQuaid's testimony made perfect sense to the jury. Rohr spent his lunch hour with Cleve, discussing what they should do about Derek. "This is what we'll do," said Rohr. "We'll give him $15,000 now, and the other 10 after the verdict. We'll promise him $25,000 for the other votes. We'll also record the interview. If we get our verdict, we won't pay, and if he causes problems, we'll threaten to call in the FBI. "I like it," Cleve said. "Get the cash. You must see him this afternoon." Cleve met him in a cheap bar. But Derek had other plans. He wanted Angel's $25,000 in cash now, and he also wanted an advance payment for each of the other jurors. $80,000 in cash now. "You're crazy," Cleve said. "And you're a crook," replied Derek. "There's no way we can pay $80,000 cash." "Fine. I'll go to the tobacco company." "You do that," said Cleve. On Thursday morning, the search for Claire had a small success. They got information about another friend of Claire's. Her name was Beverly Monk, and she lived in Greenwich Village in New York. Swanson flew to New York and phoned her, pretending to be Nicholas. He'd practiced imitating Nicholas's voice many times. "It's Jeff Kerr." "Oh, yes." Maybe she remembered him, maybe she didn't. "I'm in the city, and I wondered if you'd heard from Claire recently. I'm looking for her." "I haven't talked to Claire in 4 years. Look, I'm real busy now." "Sure." Swanson called Fitch. They decided to offer Beverly Monk cash. Fitch knew Marley would ring on Friday morning. "Hi, Fitch. Lonnie Shaver's bothering Nicholas." "Oh, damn. No, you can't do that. You've got to stop this, Marley." Fitch was aware of how desperate he sounded. "Don't do it, please. Let's talk about this." "We'll meet in an hour. Fulton Street, number 120. Fitch walked to Fulton Street. He went alone. "Are we ready to talk money?" he asked with a nasty grin. "Yes. You send me $10 million before the verdict." "You must be joking." She never stopped looking at him. $10 million, Fitch. And there's no discussion. How much is in the fund?" "The what?" he said. No one knew about the fund. "Don't play games, Fitch. I want $10 million sent to a bank in Singapore before the jury withdraws to discuss their verdict. Otherwise, the deal's off." "What happens if the deal's off?" "One of two things. Either Nicholas will split the jury, or he'll persuade it to vote 9 votes to 3 for the plaintiff." The game was over. She was in control. "So we have a deal?" "Yes," said Fitch. They shook hands. Swanson approached Beverly Monk in a corner coffee shop. "Excuse me, are you Beverly Monk?" She looked up, surprised, and said, "Yes, who are you?" "A friend of Claire Clement's." "What do you want?" She was nervous, but the shop was crowded. "You called me yesterday, didn't you?" "Yes, I did. I lied. I said I was Jeff Kerr. I'm not. I'm Jack Swanson. I work for some lawyers in Washington." "Is Claire in trouble?" "No." Swanson gave a quick explanation of Claire's summons to jury service for a huge trial in the future. "We'll pay for information," he said. "How much?" $1,000 cash to tell me everything you know about Claire Clement." Swanson took out an envelope and placed it on the table. Beverly stared at it, then grabbed it and put it in her purse. "There's not much to tell," she said. "I worked with her for 6 months. Then I left town. I called her once or twice. Then we lost contact." "Where did she go to college?" "Somewhere in the Midwest. Claire was a very secretive person. She didn't talk about her past. I didn't ask." Swanson thanked her. As he was leaving, she offered to make a few phone calls. She obviously wanted more money. Swanson said fine and gave her his business card. Hoppy sat in the back of a long black Chrysler car with Mr. Cristano. Nitchman and Napier were in the front. Hoppy had met with Nitchman and Napier the day before and admitted that Millie hadn't reacted too well to the document. "When do you see her again?" Cristano asked.
Tonight, I think.
The time has come, Hoppy, for you to tell her the truth. Hoppy's eyes watered as he stared out the window. He cursed himself for his stupidity. If he had a gun, he could almost shoot Todd Ringwald and Jimmy Hull Moak. He could definitely shoot himself.
I guess so,
he whispered. You'll have to tell her that if she doesn't support the defense's case, you will go to prison for 5 years. Hoppy started crying. In the front, Nitchman grinned. Chapter 12. Hoppy Dupree's Confession. Fitch met with Marley an hour after the previous meeting ended. How much does Roar know? He asked.
He knows nothing. We never met. I made you think I'd met him, but it never happened.
Promise me you won't get rid of Lonnie Shaver, Fitch said.
Tell me why. If we're working for the same verdict, then we have to be honest.
All I can say is that Lonnie's been bought and paid for. How many votes does Nicholas have now?
He'll have 9 votes before the jury withdraws, maybe more. He just needs a bit of help with a few, like Ricky Coleman, for instance.
We might have some information about her.
You keep playing games, so will I. What about Millie Dupree?
Nicholas had noticed Hoppy's sudden interest in the trial, and he and Marley had their suspicions that Fitch was trying to use Hoppy to persuade Millie. Fitch decided to be cautious. Nothing on Millie, he said. They discussed the other jurors briefly. Marley asked for another $25,000 to bribe Jerry Fernandez and another juror, then gave new instructions for the transfer of the $10 million. The meeting was over. Later on Friday, Fitch instructed each of the Big Four CEOs to send $2 million each to the fund immediately. There was no time for explanations. He then transferred $10 million from the fund's bank account to a new account which he opened in the Netherlands Antilles. By Friday evening, it was all done. At first, Fitch was relieved, but he knew his work wasn't finished. He didn't know the real Marley and why she was doing this. Fitch didn't like the unknown. He soon became angry and worried again. At 8 on Friday evening, Derek went to Durwood Cable's office. He was nervous, and when he asked for a Mr. Gable by mistake, he was told that no one of that name worked there. In court, Judge Harkin was worried about the jury. It was 5 on Friday. They were bored and tired. The lawyers were worried too. The jurors weren't reacting to testimony as they should be. They were staring blankly into space or trying to stay awake. Nicholas wanted the jurors to be tired. They'd listen to him more willingly. He persuaded all the jurors to sign a letter to Judge Harkin asking for the trial to continue on Saturday. Judge Harkin agreed. The trial should be over Monday afternoon, he said. We'll have closing arguments on Monday morning, and you'll receive the case before noon. That's the best I can do. There were smiles from the jury. With the end in sight, they could manage one more weekend together. There would be personal visits tonight, tomorrow night, and Sunday. Hoppy arrived in Millie's room late. He sat on her bed and put his face in his hands.
What's the matter, Hoppy?
She asked, frightened. He finally told her. Mr. Todd Ringwald, Stillwater Bay, Jimmy Hull Moak, Napier, Nitchman, and the tape. How could he have been so stupid? Millie began crying. But there was more. When he got to the part where he did a deal with Mr. Cristano, Millie stopped crying.
But I'm not sure I want to vote for the tobacco company, she said.
Wake up, Millie. If you don't, I'd go to prison for 5 years.
That's not fair.
Millie was shocked.
What about the kids?
Hoppy asked. He'd planned his arguments in advance. Millie felt she'd been hit by a bus.
It's not fair to the people in the trial, she said.
I know, honey, he replied. I know. I'm a total failure. Believe me, I've even thought about shooting myself.
Don't be silly,
she said, and started to cry again. After Hoppy had left, Millie couldn't sleep. At midnight, she went down to the party room for a snack. She found Nicholas alone. "Why are you up so late?" he asked. "You look troubled."
I am. Can you help me, Nicholas?
"I'll try." She told him everything. Nicholas suspected a scam, but didn't tell Millie that. She promised to do nothing until they spoke again. He went to his room and rang Marlee. In court on Saturday, Cable decided to start with a bit of action. His witness was a Dr. Olney, who'd done research on laboratory mice. He had a video of the mice. Over some years, the mice had been given huge doses of cigarette smoke. Not one had developed lung cancer. Hoppy was in court, listening. He'd promised Millie that he'd come to show his support. Derek sat at the back and continued to plot. Ricky Coleman's husband was also in court. So were the families of some of the other jurors. Marlee had been working since 6 on Saturday morning. She called newspaper reporters, the police, FBI information lines, and government information services. She soon decided that the whole Hoppy affair was a scam arranged by Fitch. Fitch arrived for a meeting with Marlee at 10. Earlier that morning, he'd received a report on the investigations into Claire Clement. Before she arrived in Lawrence in the summer of 1988, she hadn't existed. While in Lawrence, she made no long-distance phone calls. After she left Lawrence, the trail led nowhere. She'd probably changed her identity. Whoever she was smart.
We've got problems with Ricky Coleman, said Marlee. Nicholas thinks she wants a big verdict.
Without comment, Fitch handed Marlee a piece of paper.
So she was pregnant? You're sure this is her?
Positive.
You have nothing on Herman Grimes?
Nothing, replied Fitch. Nicholas will have to deal with him. He's getting paid for it. If there's a problem, can't you get him removed?
We're thinking about it.
Fitch shook his head in amazement. Do you realize what you're doing?
I think so. That's all for now, Fitch. I have work to do.
Later that day, Marlee received a call from an FBI agent in Biloxi called Madden. He confirmed that Nitchman, Napier, and Cristano weren't FBI agents, and he'd love to talk to them. Marlee said she'd try to arrange a meeting. At 3 on Saturday afternoon, the defense finished. The jurors were free to go. There would be trips to a football match or movie theater arranged for Saturday night, followed by personal visits. On Sunday, the jurors could go to church, and in the evening there would be more personal visits. Millie had no interest in movies, and certainly none in football. Hoppy arrived with some food, which they ate slowly. After dinner, they talked about their problems again. There were more tears and more apologies. Finally, Millie confessed that she'd told Nicholas everything. He could be trusted, she said. At 10:30, Nicholas, back from the football game, visited Millie's room. He explained to Hoppy and Millie that the whole thing was a close friend had made phone calls which confirmed that Napier, Nitchman, and Cristano weren't government agents, and that KLX Property Group didn't exist. Hoppy had been tricked. At first, Hoppy felt even more stupid. Then he had questions. What did it mean? Was it good news or bad? What about the tape, he asked, of me and Jimmy Helm Oak? I'm not worried about it, Nicholas said confidently. The tape was obtained illegally. Forget it. What sweet words. You're serious? Yes, Hoppy. The tape will never...